Imagine being plunged into the dead of winter, with winds howling like a pack of wolves outside your tiny wooden hut. The temperature has plummeted to a bone-chilling -30 degrees F, and the firewood pile you carefully stacked has long since turned to ash. Now picture this. You're a Viking, stranded on the icy shores of Scandinavia, or maybe on one of those remote North Atlantic islands. Most would think survival depends on keeping that fire roaring. But wood is so scarce in this frozen wasteland that you can't afford to light it up often. So, how on earth did these legendary Norse warriors keep warm when they had almost no wood, yet kept a fire burning that lasted not hours, but 48 hours straight? This might sound like the opening scene of a fantasy movie, but it's very real Viking ingenuity playing out in the harshest conditions imaginable. They managed to manufacture a fire that didn't just flicker and die out after 10 minutes, but instead blazed steadily for 2 full days, without adding more wood. Think about it, today we rely on electric heaters, pellet stoves, or gas fireplaces, all pumping out constant heat with automated fuel supplies. The Vikings, they had cold, scarcity, and a whole lot of grit. So, how did they pull off a fire that acted more like a 1,000-watt space heater, powered by nothing but their knowledge of nature's secrets? Here's where it gets truly fascinating. This might be the strangest Viking survival trick you've never heard of. But once you get it, it totally rewires how you think about fire and survival. Forget everything you assumed about fire needing constant fuel, because the Vikings had a method that flouted that rule entirely. They crafted something called a living ember bed that could stay hot and smolder, radiating heat at a controlled rate for up to 48 hours, without any wood added during that time. So what exactly is a living ember bed? Imagine a massive pile of charcoal and dried peat moss, layered and insulated meticulously with natural materials like moss, birch bark, and even deer moss. Yes, moss. Picture a fire pit that looks more like a giant, smoldering sponge holding heat like an ancient battery. Viking fire masters mastered the art of controlling airflow by building precise vents and channels in their pits. So instead of raging flames, the fire would breathe just enough oxygen to keep those embers glowing steadily, not too hot to flare up and not so cold that it died out. Technically, it's like the medieval version of a slow cooker or a thermal battery. Scientists today studying these ember beds note that the peat moss acts much like the insulation in modern Gore-Tex fabric, trapping heat without suffocating the oxygen flow. The charcoal maintains a temperature of around 400 degrees F to 500 degrees F, which is enough to provide warmth and even some cooking heat, but not enough to ignite the whole pile into flames that burn through fuel too fast. To put it bluntly, it worked like an ancient hot water bottle that let out a gentle, steady stream of heat. Imagine holding a putty knife to a block of warm cheese. The heat coming off is long-lasting and consistent. The Vikings harnessed that same slow-release warmth, but on a scale that could heat a room. This wasn't fire meant for spectacle or light. It was engineered heat designed to keep a hut, sometimes made of only 1-inch thick planks, just above freezing through the darkest, coldest nights. But all that warmth would vanish if the embers didn't have proper airflow and insulation. And controlling the airflow in a pre-industrial, harsh environment is no small feat. So the Vikings went one step further and insulated the ember bed with layers of dried reindeer moss, something which looks like fluffy, natural bubble wrap. This moss is incredibly light, but traps air pockets that stop the cold from stealing heat away too quickly. Think of it as nature's own high-performance thermal blanket wrapped around the fire's heart. What's more, they combined this moss insulation with carved birch bark sheets. Birch bark is full of oils that are not only waterproof, but also fire retardant. You'd expect that to be a contradiction, putting fire retardant bark near a fire. But the bark was used strategically, layered so that it slowed down the cooling effects of wind or snow while resisting burning down itself. It was like running a high-tech energy-saving door seal, stunningly simple yet incredibly effective. This brilliant layering of materials turned ordinary, even scarce, materials into a heat-retentive powerhouse. To us today, it resembles the 21st century equivalent of a triple-pane thermal window, combined with a heat-retaining hearth in your house, naturally engineered without a single screw or nail. And the Vikings didn't stop there. Remember that direct heat isn't always the best kind in freezing environments. If a flame blazes too hot, it radiates heat in short bursts and then fizzles out, leaving you cold. So instead of traditional firewood logs, the Vikings often pre-burned wood down to char, creating charcoal and charred peat that could sustain that smoldering ember bed. Charcoal is brilliant because it burns longer and produces less smoke, kind of like the difference between a bonfire and a slow-burning campfire. Now think about controlling a fire in windy, moist, near-freezing conditions. Sparks could easily catch random moss or dry twigs and turn your carefully balanced ember bed into a wildfire, or snuff it out altogether. The answer: the Vikings built clever fire pits shielded by loose stone walls and topped with thick sod roofs, both acting like the original version of a windbreaker and thermal bubble wrap in one. Picture this: under a sod roof weighing hundreds of pounds, the embers stay smoldering like a 1000 W space heater, trapped inside a mini microclimate, safe from snow or rain. The stone walls absorb radiant heat during the day, releasing it slowly at night, like a natural radiator. It's not magic, it's physics, harnessed hand in hand with Viking craftsmanship and natural materials. But even with all these techno-natural adaptations, another challenge loomed: how to keep the fire going when you weren't continuously tending it. The Viking solution was to bank the embers overnight. Think of it as putting your fire to sleep wrapped up in a warm blanket. Before nightfall, they would pile the glowing embers deep beneath layers of moss and bark, insulating it just like you would wrap a thermos in a sleeve to keep soup hot. This way, the core heat remained active, ready to be poked into a low flame again by morning, without going entirely out. To put it in modern terms, it's like the difference between an instant-on electric heater and a slow thermal mass heater that takes time to heat the room, but stays warm long after turning off. The ember bed was the latter, slow to build up but incredibly persistent. And why go through all this trouble instead of simply building a fresh fire every evening? Well, in some parts of Viking territory, wood was so scarce that each log was as precious as gold. On top of that, the iconic Viking winter nights lasted for up to 17 hours or more. Starting a fire from scratch isn't just time-consuming, it's risky. Fire-starting materials like flint, tinder, and kindling can get wet or be blown away, and attempts could fail, leaving the whole household freezing. The ember bed, therefore, was a life-saving innovation, a Viking version of a heat bank you could rely on night after night, requiring only one fire to be lit and maintained with care. A brilliant eco-friendly strategy built on patience, practical knowledge, and a deep understanding of their environment. But the innovation doesn't end there. The Vikings were also exceptional at combining their heat-retaining ember beds with their clothing and shelter strategies to maximize survival. They didn't just sit next to the fire. They adapted their whole lifestyle to make the most of every calorie of heat produced. Their clothing, primarily made from wool and animal skins, acted like nature's version of modern Gore-Tex and fleece layered together. Picture wearing what amounts to a medieval smart jacket that traps up to 70% of your body heat while wicking away moisture, keeping you dry and warm. This meant the ember bed didn't have to turn into a blazing inferno. Steady, moderate heat was enough to keep them comfortable. Their huts, often constructed with double walls of timber and turf, created pockets of insulating air, much like the double-pane windows of today's energy-efficient homes. The Vikings understood that temperature isn't just about generating heat, it's about stopping it from escaping. Sleeping arrangements added another layer of survival finesse. Instead of cold floors, they installed raised platforms lined with dried grass, moss, and animal furs. Think of it as sleeping on the medieval version of a memory foam mattress layered with thermal blankets. All of this combined with their ember beds created a survivable microclimate inside huts that otherwise might have been death traps. So the Vikings understood fire as more than just a source of light or cooking. It was a technology of survival intricately linked with shelter, clothing, and environment. It wasn't fire as a wild animal to be tamed each night, but rather a carefully managed heat well to be banked and nurtured. And that's where the mystery and genius of the two-day Viking fire lies, not in the flames, but in the embers, insulation, and management of heat across materials and seasons. Already, it's clear they had the equivalent of a high-tech heating system at their fingertips thousands of years before electricity or oil. But we're only scratching the surface. Next, we'll dive into how they started these fires in near impossible conditions without matches or lighters, the exact materials they used to keep that ember bed breathing steadily, and the astonishing ways their climate-adapted fire strategy shaped their entire way of life, even their legendary raids and voyages. So stick around, because you're about to see the Viking fire from angles no history book tells you, a fiery tale of survival, science, and cunning that's still blazing through time today. Now, picture yourself on that freezing night again. Only this time, imagine trying to spark a fire without matches, lighters, or even easy tinder. No flick of a flame, just sheer Viking grit and some mind-blowing techniques developed through centuries of harsh winters. How did they ignite these ember beds in the first place, under relentless snow and icy winds? The answer isn't just striking flint. It's about creating a perfectly balanced tinder nest, so advanced it could almost be a medieval fire-starting computer program. This might be the strangest Viking survival trick you've never heard. They used touchwood made from shredded tree fungus called amadou, more commonly known as tinder fungus. Imagine a porous, sponge-like material harvested from old birch trees, dried and beaten until it's fibrous and fluffy, almost like cotton candy but incredibly dry and flammable. When soaked in natural resins or even animal fat, this fungus became an ember magnet, able to catch a tiny spark from flint and nurture it into a steady glow without bursting into wild flames. Scientists today compare it to the tinderboxes used by scouts, but with a secret Viking twist. This fungus could hold an ember smoldering around 400 degrees F for minutes without flame, allowing the fire master to transfer that ember into their prepared peat and charcoal ember bed safely. Think of it like the original slow-release ignition source, absorbing a tiny spark, then steadily building the ember to life. Without it, starting a fire in these unforgiving conditions would have been like trying to light a wet match in a hurricane. But even the best tinder couldn't do it alone. The Vikings layered their tinder fungus in bundles wrapped with birch bark strips that worked as a natural wind shield and fire accelerator. Birch bark ignites sharply at around 600 degrees F, but also burns clean and fast, providing that initial flare without overwhelming the delicate ember bed. Picture the bark acting like a medieval torch handle, lightweight, waterproof, and perfect for transferring fire safely from one place to another. It was a delicate dance of nature's materials, expertly mastered. Now, this whole process demanded incredible timing and skill. You needed the ember hot enough to ignite peat char, but not so hot that it burned it all up in a flash. It's no exaggeration to say this knowledge was passed down like sacred lore, an essential survival skill taught from parent to child. Every flicker mattered, and failure could mean freezing through another frozen night or, worse, perishing quietly alone in the cold. But lighting and starting the fire were only part of the story. Keeping that ember alive over days required continuously managing oxygen flow. The Vikings crafted tiny breezeways and vents carved into their stone fire pits, sometimes no wider than 2 inches, to allow precise amounts of air to feed the smoldering peat and charcoal. Too much oxygen and the whole ember bed would ignite into a roaring fire and consume fuel too fast. Too little, and it would extinguish like a dying breath. Imagine them adjusting these vents like modern thermostat dials, regulating fire intensity to inch-perfect levels. These vents were often covered with specially carved wooden lids or slabs of smooth shale, which could be adjusted to seal off airflow or let it in just a fraction. The fire pits themselves were typically recessed about 1 to 2 feet deep, lined with dry clay mixed with crushed shells or sand, a primitive heat shield that protected the embers from moisture, wind, and sudden temperature drops. It's akin to a thermal incubator built with the materials of earth and stone. And it didn't stop there. The Vikings used what scientists call thermal mass to their advantage. Massive stones positioned around the ember bed absorbed heat during burning periods and slowly released it, creating a consistent warming effect for anyone huddled nearby. Imagine sitting inside a hut with rocks warm to the touch even hours after the fire had faded to embers. Those stones were not just structural but crucial thermal batteries, storing heat and preventing sudden chilling when the fire was banked. And then there's peat, a slick, dense material harvested from bogs, composed of semi-decayed organic matter that the Vikings knew like the back of their hand. Peat has a carbon content between 50% and 60%, making it an incredibly efficient source of slow-burning fuel. When dried thoroughly, sometimes for an entire season, it could smolder at a steady 400 degrees F to 600 degrees F for hours with minimal smoke, providing a continuous heat source as reliable as any modern wood pellet. Vikings carefully broke peat blocks into thin slabs, allowing for controlled burns spreading gradually rather than flaring suddenly. Picture dragging bundles of peat across snowy bogs, a source so essential and precious it could decide the fate of entire settlements. Peat wasn't just fuel, it was the backbone of their survival, transforming the harsh, frozen landscape into a reliable energy source. In fact, Viking-era peat fires created less ember loss through ash and smoke compared to raw wood fires, meaning more heat stayed where it was needed, in the hut and on the skin of the warriors. But the Vikings' fire mastery shaped more than just their heaters. It influenced their daily life, their voyages, even their legendary raids across the seas. Imagine climbing aboard a longship at dawn, the chill still biting, but beneath the deck lies a carefully banked ember bed. This slow-burning fire not only warmed the crew, but was the heart of their cooking, melting snow for fresh water, and even drying sails when wet. It was their moving hearth, kept alive by skilled fire tenders. This deep knowledge of fire management gave Vikings a unique edge. During long sea voyages, when the cold ocean spray chilled bone deep and wood was minimal, maintaining a safe ember fire was critical. Some accounts suggest Vikings carried portable ember beds sealed within metal or wooden boxes lined with moss, allowing them to stoke fires quickly when reaching new shores or starting camps in frozen lands. Imagine a fire kit designed centuries before survivalists dreamed of portable stoves or emergency heaters. Their climate-adapted fire strategy was inseparable from their navigation, their seasonal migrations, even their wintertime raids. The ability to know precisely when and how to nurture fire meant they could push further into the cold, travel faster, and strike where rivals least expected, because their warmth and energy reserves were something no one else could match. It's a kind of survival calculus based on heat, fuel, and human endurance, integrated over lifetimes of trial, error, and innovation. But why does this ancient fire wisdom matter now? Because it challenges everything we think about energy, sustainability, and resilience. In a modern world craving cleaner, smarter heat solutions, the Vikings' living ember bed teaches us about maximizing energy output, conserving fuel, and using the environment's own properties instead of fighting against them. It's a lesson from our ancestors about adaptability and making do with what you have, especially when the odds are stacked against you. And finally, every bit of that Viking ingenuity was fueled by something deeply human, an unyielding will to survive, to protect family, to keep the hearth alive no matter how dark or cold the world got. Their fires were more than heat. They were lifelines, stories spoken through tongues of ember and smoke, passed down through generations. When you think about that burning ember nest glowing softly in a snow-covered hut, it's not just science or art. It's the pulse of a people defying nature's harshest grip. So the next time you feel a chill creeping in, or watch a flicker of flame in your fireplace, remember that those old Viking fires were not just warmth. They were hope, endurance, and pure human genius blazing through the ice and darkness. And in a world where energy feels all too complicated, maybe we need to look back to those glowing embers, the ancient hot water bottles that kept warriors warm for 48 relentless hours, to find inspiration for how to thrive today. Because that Viking fire, burning slow and steady without wood, is a powerful reminder. Survival isn't about force or volume. It's about mastery of balance, patience, and knowing how to keep a spark alive, no matter what.